Hello. In this video I want to explain some lesser known facts about the drug heroin. It's a semi-synthetic drug derived from the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. Opium, the gum that is secreted from the bulb of the plant, became the narcotic of choice for the Chinese people after the British introduced them to the drug in the early 1800s. Fast forward about 100 years, the company Bayer, responsible for also aspirin, made and isolated diacetylmorphine, which is the generic name for heroin. Many concoctions and elixirs existed at the time that used this drug, as well as other potent analgesics. Back then, that industry was very combined with the dye industry, as well as even the origins of soda that we know today. The opium poppy only grows in certain areas of the world. It needs a very arid climate, and so therefore most of the cultivation of the plant takes place in Mexico, the Golden Triangle, which is East Asia, Laos, Thailand, and also Afghanistan. They produce most of the opium poppies that we use medicinally for turning into prescription opioids. Because it only grows in certain areas around the world, it sometimes has to go hundreds or thousands of miles to reach its final destination, which is places that have the biggest buyers of it, like the United States. Trafficking is dangerous for everybody involved because it can lead to long prison sentences and, in some countries, even execution. But one of the ways that makes it less problematic for the people who do that kind of thing is if they have a smaller product to smuggle. If they have a brick of something that is worth, 4 or 10 times as much as what they were distributing previously, then the costs tend to outweigh the problems in that case. Heroin is more soluble in fat than morphine, which means whenever it is administered intravenously, it is roughly twice as strong as morphine. Now, morphine is just one of the alkaloids in the opium paste. And so, by instead of smuggling the opium, if they smuggle the heroin, they are making such a smaller product. Some cartels smuggle marijuana, and this has largely been replaced by drugs that are more effective in the milligram range, like heroin is. One of the large disadvantages to the heroin business is that these traffickers have to negotiate with either poor farmers in the area or negotiate with, government subsidized farmers like in Afghanistan. One way to circumvent the problems that exist from a drug that has to be grown from the ground is something that can be made in a lab. And fortunately for the cartels, China and India are booming economies that have hundreds of laboratories throughout the countries. Now, a lot of them have been shut down because of what they're producing, but the bulk of what they produce during those years remain, and there's always going to be different analogs to the original thing of what they're producing. The drug I'm alluding to in this case is fentanyl. Unlike heroin, fentanyl is a fully synthetic drug. It is very cheap to make, basically just the cost of the precursors, and it is at least 100 times more potent than heroin. If you're a millennial like me, you probably first heard of heroin in a dare classroom, being described as the big baddie that you should never go towards or else it will ruin your life. And then around in the 2010s, news stories started popping up about fentanyl overdoses, where people were buying what they thought was heroin and overdosing because someone put way too much of the fentanyl in the dose they were expecting. Strictly as a contaminant to heroin, fentanyl makes more sense to implement once it gets to more street dealer status. It wouldn't really make sense for a cartel to put to adulterate their heroin with fentanyl, because after all they're trying to make a very small product and to what into their like truck tires and such. Many opioid users claim to know and trust their plug. After all, why would their friend try to kill them? But without regulatory oversight, like an organization like the FDA, uh, you really don't know what you're buying from these people. Fentanyl test strips are something that some cities provide free to their people, but can also be purchased very cheaply online for like $1 or so. But they do require that the user take their drug and basically turn it into a solution, which isn't ideal if you plan to smoke it or even inject it. Somewhat recently, I discovered a resource called drugsdata.org. It's a subsidiary of Arrowwood, a company that is providing life-saving harm reduction information for drug users and just the drug-adjacent people for decades now online. Drugsdata.org takes in samples that users submit along with a fee, and they analyze these substances with a process known as gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. Now, not only does the information get provided to the person who submitted the sample, but it is readily available for everyone to look at right now. And this is interesting data because it's just a bunch of different samples from recreational drug users around the world, a lot of them from the US, and a lot of them are really recent. So I guess it's a good idea of what's out there. The information provided gives us an idea of even the ratios of what substances are found in these samples. Um, it tests it against a lot of known contaminants, not necessarily inert substances. Like you probably don't see baby powder on there, even though that is a component of a large amount of cocaine. One of the more common chemicals found in the samples provided, besides fentanyl, is a drug called xylazine. It is a paralyzing agent that is used in hospitals to sedate the patients so they can undergo anesthesia and surgery. One chemical that is surprisingly missing from all these drugs that were sent in with the sample name heroin is heroin. It seems as though nearly everybody who has been submitting heroin recently to this resource don't have the drug at all. Now, there are biases that are present when collecting data from a resource like this. It is somewhat expensive to submit the drug, so there's a selection bias of people who have an extra $100 or $150 on top of the drug that they're buying. The people who are submitting this product also have to be aware of resources like this and what kind of information could be provided to them through this process. And they also just have to care about what they're ingesting. To be honest, a lot of the people who are out there who buy these drugs on the daily are not necessarily, it's not that they're not cognizant of what they're doing. They're not, but they also don't really care about what they're getting as long as it keeps them from getting dope sick. One way this data could be strengthened is if there were more submissions. I would like to see dozens per day of any given sample name to get a better idea of what's out there. Heroin users exist in the US in the hundreds of thousands. Many of these users are non-addicts and use the drug recreationally, akin to how a person who smokes a cigarette only while they're drinking is not a nicotine addict per se. According to the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, 25.4% of illegal drug users in the U.S. have a drug use disorder. Illegal drug users is kind of a broad brush. While I was doing research for one of my college classes, I stumbled across a graph that compared the dependency rates of different drugs, essentially stating that certain ones have a propensity to make users become dependent on them in the future after either one use or occasional use. Obviously, none of those rates are 100%. That is a concept known as pharmacological determinism. But what was interesting about that graph that I can't seem to find anymore was that nicotine had one of the highest dependence rates, as well as opioids, but both were somewhat analogous. I say all this to drive home the point that there are a lot of people out there who are affected by these street drugs. A lot of them hide it very well, and it may be someone you care about. So I would like it to be known that we are dealing with a different substance under a different name than we're used to. And I think that should help us discuss drug policy in the future. So whether it's in the form of opium, heroin, or fentanyl, opioid use in society is going to be a thing for the foreseeable future. The problem is constantly evolving, and the tools that we have at our disposal, where we just lock people up for years of their life or cast them off as undesirables, is just not the way to go about things. If we can better work towards taking these users and integrating them better into our society, it would lead to a more productive world. And who knows, maybe their circumstances will eventually change.